Hi everyone, I wanted to make a video today but I really just didn't feel like facing the camera, so hence the static image today of my altar. So I hope you don't mind the image of this video being a little more boring than usual. And as always, the main image on the altar, the print that I have kind of on the back of the altar there, that's by an artist called Audra O'Clair, and I will try to remember to link her in the down bar. I was thinking today again about spiritual roots, and I wanted to talk a little bit about spiritual hope and how that kind of ties in with a tendency in this kind of general pagan, new agey, alternative spiritual community with a tendency to jump around from practice to practice, or a tendency to seekership, kind of a constant seekership. I was back home in Ireland recently, and while I was there I picked up my very first, well, what I called at the time my Book of Shadows, and it's a very slim little notebook. It's nothing very exciting to look at. It's just actually maybe I will actually show you the front of the cover. I was going to try and talk over it there, but I'm using a different lens on my camera right now, so it's all a little bit difficult. But that's it. Like there's nothing much to see. It's just a recycled kind of semi-hardback notebook, and with this is a tiny little pentagram drawn onto the left top hand corner. It's a very slim little book. But yeah, there's very little really in it that I hadn't just notated down directly, mostly from websites, I think was where I was getting most of my information at this point. I very occasionally would save up enough money to go into one of the kind of new agey, pagan-y, Wicca-y stores in Dublin, of which there were actually a few more when I was a teenager, and spend some of my money on books. But it was a pretty expensive way of going about doing that. I didn't have access to any of those kind of books through libraries or anything, and I was just quite anxious about the whole thing as well. I was too kind of shy to go into a library and ask anybody if they could actually order in any of these books for me. So a lot of the research that I was doing was actually online, and most of this copybook, like I say, is just kind of me inscribing stuff that I had found online. But occasionally there's a journal entry here and there, kind of like a discussion of my thoughts, and it is really an insight into, if you can hear me turning the pages, I'm just kind of paging through it while I talk. It is kind of an insight into just some of the early thoughts that I had and the early feelings that I had, and it's very interesting to see how I was engaging with this stuff, how I was responding to it, and what my thought processes were. And in a lot of ways it's a lot more simplistic in a way than I would go about it now, because I was still at that kind of age in my mid-teens where I hadn't really decided, I suppose, where authority lay for me, and what my worldview would be going forward. I was still quite malleable and open to accepting the authority of really almost anyone if I found them convincing enough, if that makes sense, and if I felt like my own experience corroborated what they were saying. So it was very much kind of an experimental, experiential kind of practice, where I was picking up anything and everything that I found, and putting it into practice and playing around with it, and really going into it with such an open attitude of kind of really believing that anything that I was coming across could be truth, that it could be genuine, and really buying into the experiences that these people online or in books were describing and talking about. And while I am completely understanding of the fact that over time my worldviews had to kind of solidify, and it was kind of a necessary part of my continuing education and kind of maturing as an individual and learning over time, and just being socialized as well into which kind of authorities I would accept and which I would not. And that solidification and that maturation has really, it's been a positive. It's brought both positives and negatives, I think, and mostly I think it has been a positive thing. It's allowed me to use my mind in ways and my intellect in ways that wouldn't have been possible for me at this age. But I think there's definitely something that gets lost in the mix, that you kind of lose when you lose that kind of malleability that you have in your young adulthood and your kind of adolescence. And so reading through this book, like I say, while there's kind of very little of substance to it, it really does bring me back into that state of mind. And it reminds me not only of that time when I was first encountering witchcraft and Wicca and paganism and just all sorts of different areas or different forms of belief that I had not even known existed. And it was very kind of exciting to learn that there were people out there who believed these kind of things, because while I knew that there were other religions out there, I didn't know that there was anybody who believed in witchcraft, who believed that magic was real, and so on and so forth. So I was, at that very early stage of because just considering the possibility that if actual adult humans out there believe these things, that maybe I would come to believe them in time myself. And while that was not the case when it comes to kind of literal belief in magic and most of what goes along with a kind of witchy pagan worldview, it's certainly exploring and discovering that world has certainly opened me up to avenues and just ways of thinking that wouldn't have been available to me. But yeah, it not only reminds me of that feeling, that experience of being opened up to this whole new avenue of thought, it also reminds me of coming back to spirituality, coming back to paganism and just alternative spirituality in general, and just thinking about this stuff in general in my kind of early to mid 20s. And how exciting that was. How exciting it was to discover pantheistic communities and communities of people who had kind of paganish practices, but who didn't necessarily believe in the gods in the way that most pagans, most kind of in inverted commas there, but that most pagans do. And just reading about all these different practices that I never would have imagined or even considered to be worthwhile, or that I would have thought it wasn't enough to be considered spiritual or to be considered religious. Oh, you might be able to see my reflection there in the picture. If you see something waving around, that's just my hand. And yeah, it just got me thinking about how that excitement and that sense of potential when you have struck upon a new community, a new way of thinking, a new philosophy, a new practice or what have you, it is so valuable, it's so exciting, and it is actually quite difficult to replicate, I find. It's not something I find easy to go out and find. For some people perhaps it is, and I think that for some people in this community more than others, perhaps you have a bit more malleability in terms of being able to go out and find new ways of thought that you can more readily embrace and try out, whereas maybe I've become a bit more rigid over time. But yeah, it really got me thinking about how important newness is in this community and into this kind of style of practice. And I think it's not even so much about needing new ways of practicing or needing or feeling as if our old ways weren't enough. It's more about recapturing that sense of enthusiasm that we had early in our practice. Because while the same practices that we've had all along, they're probably performing in the exact same way. We're probably getting just as much out of them as we were in the beginning. But in the beginning we had all this optimism surrounding them, and even if we felt that they were a little bit flat or maybe not doing everything that we hoped that they might for us, or bringing us into these sort of transcendental ecstatic states consistently, there was still kind of this optimism and excitement in the beginning when we first started using these practices, that over time, once we learned to use them better, use these tools better, that they would bring us to those kind of states. And then over time, once the novelty kind of wears off and you kind of start to realize, right, okay, well, this is all that I'm going to get out of this. This is kind of where it's at. This is what this practice is for me. And the shine kind of comes off it in that way. You lose the optimism, and there is kind of that tendency to want to find something more. And I don't know if this is the case just with solitary practice. Perhaps this is less of an issue when there's a group, because there's a group dynamic kind of pushing things on, and it becomes more maybe about the other people, and that group dynamic might keep things maybe more fresh than in solitary practice. But I think that was, for me, that was interesting to think about, how sometimes it's not even about needing always to be incorporating new things, or needing to be letting go of old things, or because sometimes I think I find myself thinking of that as being a bit disingenuous or something, like that it's kind of a bad habit of always thinking that the grass is greener, and that I'd be much better off kind of just settling down on one thing and focusing on that and getting better at that and developing that skill. And there's something to be said for that, for really honing our ability to use one particular kind of practice, or really focusing on one tradition or one philosophy or one way of thinking, and actually really increasing our understanding of that and the depth of our knowledge on that. But I think perhaps that seeking and jumping around from kind of new spiritual thing to new spiritual thing, that there might be value in that in and of itself, just purely for the sake of the novelty of it and the sense of optimism, and just the sense that, and just kind of giving us that sense that there may be some wonderful, amazing spiritual experience that we can have through the next practice that we find, or through the next way of thought that we can find. And it's true that we do sometimes stumble upon those kind of aha moments that feel really quite transformative, and they don't always stick, but sometimes they do. So it's difficult for me at the moment, I think, to really embrace or to really delve into too much extra reading in terms of my own practice, but I have been thinking for some years that I really should be prioritizing this a bit more. And I think it's been too easy for me to feel like I'm already so busy doing a lot of kind of academic research and focusing on my PhD topic, and then therefore I have very little time to do a lot of extra kind of reading, and I have all sorts of other creative projects that I want to be working on anyway. But B, I think I have become kind of spiritually pessimistic, that I have kind of talked myself into thinking that I am quite rigid in my ways, that there are only particular kind of ways that I can believe, ways that I can practice that make sense for me, that I've kind of found my métier and I'm going to drop anchor here and that's that. And that's great and all, but the reality is that coming back to the same practices and the same beliefs over and over again doesn't always produce the same results, because, like I say, that sense of optimism is not necessarily still there. And when I come back to reading old texts, old favourites again, while they are inspiring and while they do tap me back into the kind of core of my practice, there isn't that sense of progression, there isn't that sense of moving towards the divine, of moving towards greater connection. That was there in the beginning, because it's not new, because it's not novel. And I think maybe a balance of the two is really necessary. And so yeah, coming back to my first book of Shadows is vital. It's really interesting to look back at my roots and to remember how I felt at the beginning. It's also I really enjoy reading back over kind of later journal entries back when I was in my early to mid 20s, watching old YouTube videos from that time, remembering the excitement that I felt around that time and at different stages along the past 15 years. But also I think I do want to kind of really consider genuinely what does excite me right now in the community or outside the community, what kinds of practices, what kinds of religiosity kind of just gets me excited, and not to overthink that too much, not to be thinking to myself, well, that doesn't really fit in with my worldviews, that doesn't really fit in with my practice as it stands, and just let myself read a little bit more with a little bit more curiosity, open curiosity, and kind of balance those two things, the coming back to the roots and the just exploration for the sake of exploration and for the sake of just bringing about that sense of spiritual optimism. So yeah, let me know what you think about this, and I would offer to show you some of my Book of Shadows. I was almost going to say that I might turn the camera on it now, but you know what, it is actually, for all that it's not very deep and it's not very, there's not a lot of depth or a lot to it, It is actually a very personal, private thing, and I'm having looked through it, I can't see a single page that I would feel comfortable sharing. So I won't offer that, I'm afraid. It's funny how I felt more comfortable sharing certain pages on camera of my teenage journals, but I think I almost wrote them more with an audience in mind. I always had this kind of vague narcissistic idea that I might let kind of people read these things in the future. Whereas the Book of Shadows is very much private, very much for my eyes only, and that was how it was written. I'm sure that any of you who have ever had a Book of Shadows or a Book of Mirrors or any kind of spiritual journal will probably be able to relate to that. So yeah, thanks for watching, or for listening, more like. Do let me know your thoughts and what keeps you kind of spiritually optimistic and what kind of keeps you ticking. And yeah, hopefully I might make another video on this topic if I come up with what it is that I am actually spiritually interested in right now, and I might find that I'm surprised by what that is, because like I say, it might not be something that's particularly relevant or that makes a lot of sense in the context of what I've been up to spiritually in the last couple of years. And you know, that's okay. That's kind of the joy of having a personal spiritual practice that is self-made and not in a group, and that it isn't kind of constrained in any way, that yeah, you can kind of feel free to explore whatever you want, read whatever you want, think about whatever you want, and just not worry about how it all makes sense or hangs together. So yeah, let me know your thoughts. And as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell button so that you always get notified and see when I post new videos. And I'll talk to you again soon.